Hi everyone and welcome to Sensemaker Live, which is brought to you by Santander. I'm Claudia, one of the reporters who works on Sensemaker each week, and thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know, Sensemaker is a daily email where we take some of the biggest news stories of the day and we try to work out what just happened. And in Sensemaker Live, we take one of the biggest themes of the week and we try to dig a little bit deeper. Today, we will be discussing the impact of coronavirus on children, which is something that has been in and out of the news for the past few months, really. And I know at Tortoise, we've spoken about it quite a lot in terms of exacerbating existing inequalities, particularly the widening attainment gap and safeguarding concerns for vulnerable children. And this week has kind of been bookended by some quite big policies seeking to counter those worries. So we started with Marcus Rashford, the United footballer, forcing a government U-turn, which means that 1.3 million children will now receive free school meals over summer. And we ended the week with today an announcement that the government will be providing £1 billion worth of grants and subsidies for schools in England. And hopefully we will be able to talk to Sarah Waite later on in this conversation, who is the founder of one of the tutoring charities involved in that. But there were two other things that really grabbed my attention this week, and there are two open letters published. The first was signed by 100 specialists in psychology, mental health and neuroscience, and the second was signed by 1,500 of the UK's paediatricians. And they both highlighted the long-term problems facing children and adolescents of all backgrounds caused by the prolonged absence from school and lack of social contact in these kind of crucial years for development. And so much of that kind of emotional health development happens during school years, when you're just hanging out or you're playing, or that kind of not necessarily curriculum-based learning. And we are delighted to be joined today by Professor Ellen Townsend, who organised one of those letters. But before we speak to Ellen, I should go through a few rules with you. I imagine some of you have been to these before. I bet you're used to Zoom by now, but it's worth going through the rules just in case. I should explain who we are. We are Tortoise. We are a news publisher. We focus on slow news rather than breaking news. So we're not going to be sending you, breaking news updates on your phone, but we do kind of long form investigative pieces looking at the forces driving the news. And these think-ins are kind of the heart of our journalism, and we hold them digitally almost every day at the moment. And they're kind of an exercise in listening. So it's about you, our members, coming together to discuss a topic that we find interesting, and we kind of want to work out what we think about it. They're based off editorial conferences, and so they are not a panel discussion. So we do have some experts and some speakers, but it's not a question and answer situation. It's, a conversation between everyone involved, and I would love to hear from you as much as possible. There is just one rule, and that is no questions. So we want to hear what you think, want to hear about your experiences, your perspective. That is the aim. And you can get involved in two ways. The first way is to raise your hand, and that is your digital hand. And you can do that by clicking on the participants button, which is at the bottom of your screen. And that will bring up kind of a tab at the side of your screen, and you can choose the option to raise hand, and a blue digital hand will pop up on the chat list, and I will know to come to you. See, Katie Vanek-Smith, one of our founders, has just shown everyone what it looks like, and we will come to you. We'll put you on the screen. It's best if you have your video on. That's great, just makes it a bit more friendly, and you can take the floor. The other way that you can get involved is to get involved on the chat, which is being manned by my excellent colleague Barney, who is also one of Team Sensemaker. He can help you there with any digital problems that you have. He'll be much better at dealing with that than me. But yeah, exactly, have a Barney with Barney. But he is also going to be there curating a chat alongside the conversation that goes on screen. And I should let you know that we are recording this just to share the best bits with people who can't be here. And I think that is everything, all the kind of bits to get through, and we can get going. I'd like to start by just asking a couple of questions of everyone who is here. mainly to test that everyone knows where their hand is, but also because I'm very interested, who here has been concerned before now, or it's something that they've been thinking out about throughout lockdown, about the impact this is happening, the impact this is all having on your own children, or children that you work with, children you spend time with, children that you know? Liz, one of our brilliant editors who I'll be speaking to later, his hand went up immediately in real life. Okay, so immediately loads and loads of hands. So this is something that quite understandably has been on people's minds throughout this. And if possible, I would love for some of you to kind of talk about that a bit later on in the conversation. So then, of those people who have had those concerns, how many of you have actively taken steps to try and deal with that, who have had to change the way that you parent, or the way that you teach, or the way that you behave around your siblings, or anything like that, and you've had to consciously think about that and you've changed something? So again, quite a few. Brilliant. If possible, I would love for some of you to keep your hands up and tell us a bit about that. I realise, obviously not if it's personal, but would love to hear some of the changes that you felt have been important to make or have been helpful. That would be brilliant. But first, I'm going to speak or introduce Professor Ellen Townsend, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Nottingham and an expert in the fields of self-harm and suicide prevention. And as I mentioned earlier, she was the organiser of an open letter, which was published in the Sunday Times earlier this week, signed by over 100 of her fellow professionals, and which urged Gavin Williamson not to delay the reopening of schools. So, hi Ellen, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I was wondering if, just to start with, you could maybe explain to people who haven't read the letter or seen the letter what it was that you and your colleagues felt, was so important to go public and kind of bring to the attention of the Education Secretary.
Yeah, thanks. I think from the start, not just myself, but many people working in mental health, and particularly child and adolescent mental health, were really worried about how little young people had been considered in policy making in this crisis. From the start, I think if you look at my Twitter feed, there's a lot of me ranting about what I call big picture thinking, so that, we have to do risk benefit analysis of the decisions that we make in these unusual times. And as a mental health researcher, I lead the self-harm research group at the University of Nottingham. And we know that the key risk factors that are likely to increase self-destructive thoughts and feelings include things like defeat, entrapment, loneliness, social isolation, hopelessness, and anger. So I was worried that this was not going to be a great scenario for people to start with. That's not to say that any of those things are inevitable, and much of it is preventable. And I think many leaders in my field have been anxious to point that out. But unfortunately, we now see converging evidence of the impact on young people, from small children to adolescents, from charities, from helpline reporting, from national surveys, that things like anxiety and loneliness are going up, and loneliness in comparison, for example, to parents. So young people are feeling much more lonely than their parents. And of course, at the heart of this, we must acknowledge that young people do not seem to suffer, thank goodness, from this illness. Neither do they seem to be significant in spreading, so they seem to play a minor role. Even more evidence has come out on that this week. What we do know is that their education is suffering vastly. You talked about the attainment gap. This is widening every day, with vulnerable children being left behind. It's really, really terrifying. But all children are going to be affected by this. They need to socialise. They need to play. It's vital for their well-being and for their development, how they make sense of the world. So putting all this together, we felt, and other authors have written on this, that the current situation is really not in the best interest of children. So that, it's against the rights of the child. So the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, and quite a few people have have written about that. And we all feel that children really have sacrificed enough now. We need to prioritise them as we emerge from the lockdown, and to release them so that they can play, so that they can socialise, so that they can learn as normally as possible, as soon as possible. And I think we need to be asking ourselves the question now, is it safe for children not to be released from the lockdown?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's a really interesting point, and I think one that we will probably touch on a little bit later. In terms of the current situation with young children and mental health, I was wondering if you could just kind of paint a picture for us about before the crisis, before the coronavirus crisis. How were mental health services for children? What was the situation then, and kind of where have we ended up now?
Well, I guess there are a couple of things to note. One, that for younger children, we know that going into the pandemic and lockdown, anxiety is the thing that looms largest. So young people needing help for the younger ones. We know that from national surveys, mental health issues were on the rise generally for adolescents. We're not entirely sure why that's the case, but so you've got increasing demand. And I think the other thing to note is that in terms of demand, current services cannot meet demand even before the lockdown. So if you think about some of the statistics we're seeing from increased calls to helplines and so on, about all kinds of issues, including mental health, we just know that the face-to-face provision is inadequate already, was inadequate already going into lockdown. So these, like I said, a lot of the risk factors that we worry about in terms of mental health are just ratcheting up the longer we stay in lockdown, particularly isolation and loneliness.
And then, so what role do schools normally play in that situation? Are they usually are children getting help from schools and then that's been taken away as well, or how does it work?
There is some provision in schools, and we know that there is sort of provision in terms of nurses. Some places have other things like therapy dogs, they have counsellors, and teachers are really important. So when you ask young people who would they reach out to, often it's a teacher, it's someone that they trust who's an adult. It's important to say in the letter, I guess the catalyst was Gavin Williamson saying, right, no, you can't be going back to school. That, I guess, was the final straw for me. But we're talking about more widely getting children back to their life. Learning is important, but I would say we have to prioritise playing and socialising face-to-face as a matter of really, utmost urgency.
Yeah, because I think that's there has been quite a lot of focus on, and rightly so, as we've discussed, this attainment gap and parts of the curriculum that children have missed, but there's been less focus on just how important going out and seeing your friends and playing, and how school isn't just about maths or this kind of thing, is it? You learn a lot about being a young person from being around your friends.
It's a hugely sensitive period of development. So in terms of peer attachments, for one thing, we also know that most mental health problems emerge before you're age 24. So it's a really sensitive period from that point of view as well. Moreover, we know that really good peer relationships protect against mental health problems and can strengthen what we might call resilience. So the ability to deal with crises, the ability to problem solve your way out of difficult situations, all of that good stuff that you get from relationships and strong peer relationships is really vital, a really protective factor.
Yeah. And so then I guess the concern is not just the immediate, these mental health issues, if they do happen, they could have a much longer term impact on children. Is that right?
I think both the mental health problems themselves and the social isolation is a stressor. We know that from animal studies. And not having that face-to-face contact might be really having a deleterious effect on children of all ages, I think, across the spectrum. You know, we've never been in this situation before. And I guess we understood that going into lockdown, it was an emergency situation. We're not in an emergency situation now. And I would say the emergency actually is young people and how they're going to cope, you know, in the future.
Sorry, just to interrupt, someone's just messaged me to ask if we could both speak slightly closer to our microphones, if that's all right. So, that's for me as well. So then, if you compare so as we discussed, if you compare the physical risks of coronavirus to the mental health risks from the letter and what you've just said, we have to really focus on the the social side of things now. And would you say that, you know, what would you say needs to happen? What would you like to happen? Would it be for schools to go back sooner, or for summer schools to be brought in, or, you know, is it the one-to-one tutoring that's been brought in this morning?
I think summer schools would be a great idea to facilitate that socialisation and playing. So, you know, anything that we can get children doing in terms of sport or music or, you know, arts, all of that I think would be incredibly powerful. But essentially, I think we need to remove, you know, social distancing for young people as much as we possibly can right now.
And then just to go back, there was a stat in the letter that your letter that really jumped out at me, which is, I guess, shocking to me, but maybe I should have known this. I think it's that the primary cause of death in people, and do correct me if I'm wrong on this, under 19 is suicide.
That's data, so Office for National Statistics data. And you're not the only person. Pretty much when I give talks, I start talking about some of the statistics and I can literally see the jaws dropping. So it's for children aged 5 to 19, it is the leading cause of death in England and Wales. Globally, whole of the world, it's the second cause of death. So it's really significant. And
if you can, what is it for young children that is creating this mental health? Do we know what's creating this mental health crisis? Are there factors that we should, or like, you know, outside the coronavirus situation, are there things that we should be doing as a society? Does it need more research? Is there, you know, kind of evidence?
Yeah, I think there aren't any easy answers, and we have had a predominance of what we might call a medical model to understand mental health problems. We know that austerity and, you know, poverty can have a huge impact on mental health, so environmental factors. So the longer we keep in lockdown, the longer, the more deleterious the effect on the economy, the more, you know, it's all kind of linked together. Some people worry about the impact of social media for young people. That is a question that is still being debated. We need much more high quality evidence on that. It's clear for some young people it's very problematic. It's clear for some other young people it's really supportive. It depends on the type of engagement. It's not so much the amount of engagement, it's the type that seems to matter. And young people are under a lot of pressure, you know, to achieve educationally, you know, expectations to go to university and all of that. I think young people now are under an awful lot of pressure.
I think, yeah, I would be really interested if there are any parents or teachers or anyone who have joined us today who might have changed their perspective or their kind of policy on social media, because I think it was I think there was an opinion piece in the Lancet, the medical journal, about the impact of coronavirus on adolescents in particular, taking a, you know, similarly to what we've just been discussing, that this is a crucial time for development. This is, you know, face-to-face, peer-to-peer contact is vital, but then suggesting that potentially social media could be mitigating that issue. So I wonder if there's any parents or anyone here who's been quite strict previously and has decided that now's not the time to be so strict. Do put your hand up if you would like to be involved. And I should say as well that if anyone does want to chip in at any point, please do just raise a blue hand. As I said, you can just find it at the bottom of your screen, click the participants, button and raise hand will come up as an option. Thank you so much, Ellen. I might come back to you with a few more questions if that's all right. But I think that's probably a good moment to bring in my colleague Liz Mosley, who is a fantastic editor at Tortoise, a legend of the newsroom, and who last week wrote a brilliant Sensemaker on this subject and on the government's decision to delay the schools opening, and that was in part a prompt for this discussion. And I wonder if you could tell us what it was that kind of riled you.
Yeah, well, I'm just to say I'm speaking in my capacity as a non-expert common or garden parent rather than anything else. I'm not even particularly speaking journalistically. But I felt for some time, probably a couple of months, that kids were getting the thin end of the wedge in terms of focus. We at Tortoise in quite a lot of thinkings heard a lot from older young people, by which I mean the sort of GCSE and A-level cohort, about exams, and I'm worried about if I get my grades and what have you, and that's valid, absolutely. But I have heard about and read about precious little until probably the last couple of weeks about younger children. We've heard a lot about parents struggling, working from home and balancing everything. I've heard a lot about regression in, domestic and parenting duties falling onto women and mums in particular. So I've heard a lot about that stuff, but not really about the kids. And I'm a parent of a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, a boy and a girl, and they're normally, sunny and well adjusted and lovely kids. And my daughter in particular is my youngest, has changed a lot. Her demeanour has changed a lot since lockdown. They are both now back at school. 2 weeks ago they went back because my ex-husband, who they live with, is a key worker. He works in school actually. But about 6 weeks ago, my daughter pulled all of her eyelashes out, and I hadn't seen her for 5 days because I see them at the weekend and not in the week. And when I saw her, I noticed it straight away. And that's a sign, hair pulling is a common, symptom. It's a sort of mild form of self-harm or coping or something. Very tearful. She's in her room a lot more than she was before. My son is also now very tearful and worrying about the virus since he's gone back to school, because you go back to school and of course it's not normal school. It's really weird. It's a really odd atmosphere. They're in a little bubble with kids all different ages. It's not their normal, peer group. And my daughter mentioned how she sits at her little table that's just for her. She was excited about the idea of having a desk. I mean, that's cool, right? Getting your own desk and your own pencils and everything, that was all really exciting. But she gets there and there's a big yellow taped square on one half of it where she can't touch or put anything. And that's where Mr. Harris has to go. And when he talks to her and teaches her. And actually the going back to school in this very stilted, odd environment has made I think their coping, it set them back. I was thrilled when they got to go back to school, so I thought at last, there's a bit of jollity and it would be a bit, but it's really, I think the fear, because it looks so weird, has made it worse. And I was interested to hear on the radio one morning this week, a spokesperson for, I think, one of the teachers' unions talking about how when kids do go back, whatever it is, the schools are braced for a really extensive period of adjustment, not only about catching up academically, if they ever will, but about readjusting to what is a very frightening environment, and kids who won't be able to concentrate and who will be worried and who will have forgotten how to be in a social situation and having to relearn negotiating when you fall out with your friends and all of that stuff that you kind of, they're so malleable. And Ellen was talking about it, mental health provision was in crisis before this happened, and I just dread to think. And as a parent, I don't know how to help them. I just don't know. I mean, you sort of read what you can and you listen and and you love them, but I just don't know how to help them. And I'm really, really frightened on their behalf.
Thank you for sharing that, Liz. And your poor lovely daughter. How do you feel like they're doing compared to their friends? Do you think that are you speaking to other parents who are experiencing the same thing? Do they talk to their friends about this kind of thing, or are they at the stage where they're coming home and saying this person is also feeling like this, or is that not really happening?
I have my good buddies who have kids. Obviously, we, in your Zoom chats, how is it in your house, kind of thing. And I think there are patches where people are doing okay and patches where they're not doing okay. Everybody's family is different. My kids are dealing with a separation as well, which is another factor of discombobulation for them. My very good friend's son, who is 10 and has Asperger's, he's absolutely thriving in lockdown. He loves it because they finally have full control over the environment, and the routine is settled, and he's all, and she says he's just coming on in leaps and bounds. Yeah. So I don't think there's one size fits all. I suppose what I wanted to highlight when I wrote the Sensemaker was this feeling I had, which is that it is absolutely right to focus on widening inequality gaps. It's absolutely right to move heaven and earth to make sure that those kids that are at risk in a normal world, in chaotic or difficult or abusive families or whatever it is, that those kids are the front of the queue to not be drop off. That's absolutely right. But my point is, all children, normal children in loving, stable homes, many, many, many of them are going to find that they are now becoming in need of special help. And to Ellen's point, the quicker we can get my son back into Cubs, honestly, the better. I think even just once a week to be able to charge around a field and come home covered in filth would do him the world of good, honestly.
And do you think that well, I guess from what you said, it might be less of a situation where it's special help for children. It's a situation where all children need this help, and it becomes something that is just, we accept as necessary, just as we're doing one-to-one tutoring or things for some children. Mental health provision will have to be there, and social help, will have to be there for all children that have gone back to school.
I do wonder how I don't know if it's the curriculum, that might not be quite the right word, but I do wonder how in lessons, they do personal and social education lessons, don't they, and how to be a good citizen and what have you. I do wonder how teachers will be helped and supported and will figure out, teachers are unbelievably brilliant and hardworking people, endlessly coming up with great ways in, that I think talking about what's just happened will need to be front and center in the way that schools of all kinds kind of deal with it in the sort of process of readjustment, for sure. And I'm sure that there are already brilliant people thinking about how that's going to happen, and how that will be managed.
Thank you so much, Liz. I might come back to you in a second, if that's all right. But if possible, I would love to speak to Sarah Waite, if Sarah is here, if that's possible. Hi Sarah, thanks so much for joining us. So Sarah is the founder and chief executive of Get Further, one of the charities that will be delivering the catch-up tutoring subsidies announced by the government this morning. And you were previously, I believe, the political advisor to the Shadow Education Secretary and head of policy at the Social Mobility Commission. So thank you so much for joining us today. I just thought to Liz's point really about what can happen, what's happening, what policies are being enacted, what practical solutions are being kind of introduced, that might be a good time for you to kind of talk about what it is that you guys do and this morning's announcement and things like that.
Yeah, so I completely agree with everything that's been said about the need to support students and young people and children pastorally, as well as with academic catch-up. And I think the interesting thing about the announcement that's happened today, so it's an announcement that will mean that students in schools get matched for small group tuition to support them to make up for some of the learning they've lost over this period. But it doesn't actually stretch to provide any sort of catch up for young people in post-16 education, and it doesn't cover any additional uplift in funding for children in early years that may have missed out on the interaction and learning that they get in those settings. So there's still quite a lot of gaps in terms of the the policy offer at the moment to support students to make up for the learning that they've lost because of coronavirus. I mean, that's a real shame, really, because we know, for example, if you take 16-year-olds in the country at the moment, current year 11, we know from surveys that Teacher Tap have done that show that they are less likely compared to any other year group to have received any sort of education during this crisis. Lots of schools have simply stopped, providing any sort of, activities or worksheets to that year group. They're also not being invited back to schools or, for any sort of transition to, their sixth form or their college or whatever their next steps are, which means when the autumn rolls around, they'll have had around 6 months of a gap in their education. And we know from all the studies that have been done around learning loss that that's really substantial, and it's going to be a really difficult challenge for colleges, for example, to help those students to pick up with where they were, address any gaps that have emerged and support them to make progress. And it's a big problem in particular for 1 in 3 year 11s who miss out on GCSE at grade C or grade 4, which is the new language for grades, in English and maths in particular, because we know that those two qualifications really unlock so much more in terms of further study, employment later down the line. If you miss out on GCSE English at grade C by 1 mark, your chances of becoming not in education, employment or training at 18 increase by 1/3. And that's just the impact of missing out by a mark. So 1 in 3 of these year 11s will move on to a new setting, a further education college. They'll need to retake these qualifications. They'll have had 6 months off, essentially, school. And there is no offer of support at the moment to help them catch up. So there's huge problems, I think, still coming down the line, even on top of what's already been announced.
And how does, so from your perspective, how does one-to-one tutoring specifically solve some of the problems that kids are going to be facing?
Yeah, I think, I mean, even, being candid, we provide tuition and it's super effective, but, it won't necessarily even make up entirely everything that's been lost because of the extent of what's been lost. But what we do know is that, there have been lots and lots of studies in one-to-one and small group tuition, and it is one of the most effective types of interventions that exists in education, and it can support students to make more progress in the shortest amount of time. So actually, there's lots of different reasons for that. There's things like the opportunity to get really focused, targeted, tailored feedback from a teacher. There's stuff around the relationship that young people have with their tutor and how they build up that really strong bond, and that can help them in terms of learning as well. So we know from research that it is really, really effective, and that is why the catch-up package has been announced today. It definitely is the right sort of thing that can help to make up for lost learning. It's just at the moment, it's not quite extensive enough in terms of who is able to access that. And it's a problem as well because, lots of young people, children out there in the country, if you come from a family that's, more advantaged, right now, a parent who's concerned may be able to pay for a tutor, and may have been doing so every week since the lockdown began, potentially even every day. So actually, that's a problem in the sense that, there's a group of students who just can't, they're not in the kind of, income bracket to be able to afford to do that. So it will have a big knock-on impact on the attainment gap and education inequality in this country if there isn't a meaningful, comprehensive offer in place to stop that gap from widening.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sarah. I think we also have Shirley Reynolds in the conversation. If we could go to Shirley, who is a professor at Reading University. Hi, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi. Hello.
Professor at Reading University and an expert
Hi
on
there.
depression and anxiety disorders in children, I believe. Thank you so much for joining us. As I said, have the kind of conversation that we've been having about the experiences of children going back to school, as Liz was saying about her kids, is that something that you have, it sounds, you know, that's what you've been hearing? Is that kind of your experience as well?
Yeah, can you hear me all right? I'm
Yes,
sorry, I've just
perfect, thank
come in, and I've also joined late, so apologise for that.
Oh, no. Oh.
So, yeah, the work I've been involved with has been looking at the impact of loneliness and social isolation on young people's well-being. So in that regard, it relates to being away from their friends, being away from their social contacts, and being back at school would clearly be an important element of tackling that difficulty. So yeah, so it does, you know, for me, school is one way of solving that problem, and it's an obvious way, and it's where, you know, so many other resources are available to young people. I mean, I think there's a lot of emphasis obviously on their educational disadvantage that's associated with being away from school, but I think for me, my interests are much more really about the emotional and other disadvantages from not being able to play with your friends, not being able to spend time with your friends, just not having that normal childhood young person experience, just hanging out with your friends. So yeah, I mean, it's not directly relevant to the educational side of things, but of course these things are very closely linked to each other. So
no, completely. I think it's important to consider this from as kind of rounded perspective as we can. If not school, what would your kind of suggestion be? So would it be, as Liz mentioned, bringing back clubs or social options?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's ridiculous. Well, to me, it seems extraordinary that, you know, in our local park, there's people hanging out all over the park, but the one bit of the park that's not accessible to anybody is the playground.
Yeah,
I don't understand that. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. That all, you know, I live in not outside London, but our parks are just as modern as the ones you see in London. But so there's families there with their children doing all manner of different things, but there's no ability for the children to actually play or in the area that's designed specifically for them. It just seems odd. Yeah, so I think, you know, I've got, you know, it's the ability of children from different families to get together and just kind of be ordinary and be normal that I think we're missing out on. And that could obviously happen at school, but it doesn't only have to be school. So yes, clubs, like I think I heard somebody mention clubs, for example, is an obvious example of that. But I think informal, unstructured play is perhaps what we're also missing. So children will go back to school, they'll be kind of disciplined, sitting in their own little desk, you know, on their own, 2 meters away from their friends. That's going to be good, I suppose, for some young people, but how do they do just unstructured free play in that kind of an environment? I don't understand how that can happen, or indeed if it can happen at all.
And why is that kind of play so important for kids?
Well, unstructured play is how, you know, that's work for children, essentially. I mean, that's how children learn. It's about exploration, it's about using your imagination, it's about teamwork, it's about relationships, it's about finding out about the world. It is how children kind of develop through play. You know, and it needs to be free rather than planned. You know, it's not about following rules. Play is defined, you know, when there aren't rules, when you make up your rules as you go along. So it's just a completely whole kind of, it's a cognitive experience, it's an emotional experience, it's a sensory experience, it's an interpersonal experience, and it's creative in a way that imposed games can never be. So it's a kind of bottom-up approach to learning.
And what are your kind of concerns for these young people looking forward? You know, the kind of long-term impact of this in terms of anxiety and depression.
I think it's really difficult to know. Obviously, we're all kind of guessing what the long-term effects are going to be, but it's going to be a mark on everybody's kind of collective memory here, isn't it? So we're going to define, you know, people's childhoods by, were you, you know, what age were you when we had that lockdown in the year 2000? You know, for some young people, I think we've already, somebody said earlier, I think, you know, some young people are actually benefiting from this. So we have to be a kind of, keep an open mind on it. I think, you know, for the majority of well-supported young people living in families that can provide resources for them, they're going to be absolutely fine. So I don't see this as a kind of national catastrophe in terms of the children's mental health, but I think vulnerable children are going to be more vulnerable. And those who are on the margins are going to perhaps potentially be more likely to tip into that very risky category. So I think the risk of all sorts of mental health problems goes up across the board, but some will have clearly much more risk than others. And that group, I think I heard Ellen towards the end, you know, there's a particularly vulnerable group we really have to be very concerned about.
Thank you.
But I do think it's quite important also to say, you know, most children will be fine. So we shouldn't, you know, it's a kind of difficult message to go across. Let's worry about it, but let's not worry about it completely and utterly and involve everybody in that worry.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Shirley. There are a few hands up, so let's go to Keith Dudleston and then we'll go to Alice Hodkinson if we can. Hi Keith, thanks for joining us.
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're perfect. I can hear you loud and clear.
Good. Thanks very much. I feel quite strongly about this because I feel people of my generation and perhaps my gender have set the scene of this corona epidemic and completely overreacted to it and are going to cause such a lot of trouble. I'm not really reassured by our last speaker that a lot of children aren't going to be affected. I mean, how would you feel as an 8 or 10-year-old child told you got to go back to school, but everybody's got to be separate in different tables and everything's going to be changed, and not feel scared? I think they must all feel terrified, really, even if they pretend they're not, because it's a terrible situation to be in, particularly as they are under no risk themselves, and very little risk of passing it on to adults. I feel it's a complete overreaction. Indeed, I don't feel the schools, especially for young children, should have ever been closed. I think it's been a disaster. Closing schools hasn't stopped the pandemic in the slightest way, and it's done all this damage.
Thank you, Keith. Let's go to Alice, and then we will go to Catherine.
Hi everyone, so I'm a doctor, I'm a GP, but I'm working in an emergency department at the moment. So I've been seeing people come in with, you know, all the COVID related illnesses and all the non-COVID related illnesses. I think the thing that's been striking me about the children is how fearful parents are that their small child will get COVID and how this will be an absolute disaster. And so one of the things, the messaging that the government put out right at the beginning about, you know, stay safe, stay at home, protect the NHS, has, I mean, it had its initial effects. There's everyone locked down a lot more effectively than anyone thought we would, but it's had this huge knock-on that parents are terrified that their children will get COVID, when of course, as Keith and everyone else has said, the risk is very low. And I've seen this when parents have reluctantly brought their children to the emergency department, and they've got visors on, they've got masks on, they've got gloves, and that just shows to me quite how much the government via the parents are terrifying the children. Because then when you say, actually, come on, let's take some of these things off, you know, I'm the one, I've got to protect myself from giving it to anyone else, but this child's not going to give it to me. And I think we've just got to be very we've got to have a much more grown-up conversation about, this isn't about children staying safe, this is about there's got to be a difference in the messaging, and I think the government really needs to change what it's saying to make sure that children are not so fearful. And actually, we've got to get at the parents to make sure that they understand that too, because it's doing so much harm.
And
I think.
No, thank you so much for that. And how, from your perspective, what kind of shift do you think needs to happen in messaging? What is it that would be helpful? What message would be helpful to get across here, other than just, your children probably won't pass it on? Is it, Sorry.
I think that's got to be far more directly talked about. That this is about the only forum that I've heard it discussed widely. I haven't heard it on the general news about the incredibly low risk that children have of spreading the infection. So when I was first hearing about children going back to school, my main concern obviously is not for the children. I mean, some children obviously do get very sick, and one friend's child at the age of 13 has been unwell the whole of the term. But that's really unusual. So I think the media have not done a very good job of talking about the real risks here. And I don't think they've been very realistic about the idea of what's going to happen as we come out of lockdown, what's going to happen to the spread of the virus, what happens to the people who've had it, what's happened to the people who haven't had it. I don't think we're going to get rid of it entirely. This is an incredibly well-evolved virus that isn't going away anytime soon. I mean, we might get a vaccine, but that's by no means certain. In the meantime, we shouldn't be shutting away our children and causing so much fear. The time for the fear is over. The time for the realism is now. And that's and I'm not seeing the leadership from the government, I'm afraid, on this.
Thank you. Someone in the chat has just asked a question that you might be able to answer, Alice, but don't worry if you can't. Is how sure are we on this point about children not being able to spread it, even if they are asymptomatic?
I did post a link to a paper right at the top of the chat, so do have a look at that. I mean, we can never say never, can we, with anything, and it's very difficult to prove a negative. It would appear that certainly the risk of children spreading it is very low. It seems to be the adult-to-adult spread within schools, for example. No, of course, I can't say it's definite, but there's quite a lot of papers published now which seem to say that the risk is low. I suspect that children, when they are ill, can spread it, but they're few and far between. I think one or two of the other people who were speaking earlier have said similar things as well.
They have, and I should say that Katie has reposted your the paper that you shared in the chat, so if anyone missed it earlier and would like to click on it, it is there now. Thank you so much, Alice. Let's go to Catherine, whose hand is up, and then we will go to Tessa. Hi, Catherine. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, there's so much to say on this subject, and it's really fascinating, so thank you for running this. I really wanted to pick up on Liz's point about how this isn't a one-size-fits-all situation. So I look at my own two children who are experiencing this very differently, and for one of them, who's on the autistic spectrum, it's almost been the making of him. From a mental well-being point of view, he's absolutely flourishing, whereas the school situation was very difficult. However, I'm aware it's a temporary moment of freedom for him, and at some point he's going to have to adjust to going back to school, which I fear is going to be much, much harder because of this extended period of absence. But in terms of solutions and how we support kids in terms of what they've missed, both from an academic point of view, but also from a social interaction point of view, I have some real concerns about what's being put forward, because it sounds great, lots of tutoring and all that sort of thing, but having had the experience of special educational needs support, it's incredibly patchy. It's very difficult to access support, even when you've got, you know, known conditions. So I'm curious as to where this sort of massive resource is going to come from to suddenly support a much bigger group of children with probably a far more complex range of issues, both in terms of sort of mental health support needs and academic support needs. So that, I think, is a real concern. But also, I think it was really interesting to think about the impact on children of the virus itself. And I agree that there needs to be some rebalancing of the messaging around this, because the perception is that it is utterly lethal and it's very frightening for the children. And I agree that the idea of going back to school with lots of separation is also very unnatural and very frightening. And what we don't seem to be hearing, or certainly what I don't seem to be hearing, is any kind of, when people are talking about the impact of this virus, they're not relating it to daily risk. You know, the reality is nothing we do is risk-free. And I completely see that this is, you know, this is a totally different situation and everybody's learning as they go and all the rest of it. But I think we have stopped giving people comparative information, you know, like the risk of driving a car, the risk of going on holiday, whatever it might be, something that at least enables people to make some calculations about whether they should or shouldn't send their child to school, or whether they should or shouldn't allow them to play, because it's all being seen just in isolation, just of this virus. And of course, that's not life, is it? That's not how we live. And the other thing I just wanted to sort of throw out there, because we haven't really sort of touched on it, is in terms of the future and looking ahead at September, I don't see that we're going to suddenly have all children back at school full time the way things are going. What can we all start to do to improve that interaction with the tools that we've got? Because that to me has been one of the sadnesses of all of this, is not just that the kids aren't going to school, but they're not having any interaction with their teachers. Now, I don't believe that that's the case everywhere, but certainly from our experience, interaction like this, you know, we know that Zoom is possible. I mean, look at how much Tortoise has been doing over Zoom in this period. Why are kids not being allowed to attend lessons over Zoom? Why is that not universal? Because it might not be perfect, and I appreciate there would be some access issues for some people, but it might mean that for those that can't access that, there's a smaller group of people that could be supported in other ways. So those were just a few thoughts, really.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Catherine. Let's go to Tessa, and then we'll go to Professor Lucy Huberman.
Hi. Hi, Claudia. Hi.
How are you?
Lovely to see you. I just want to make 2 quick points. I think, first of all, this conversation does feel like it splits between younger children and older children. So I can only speak to having 16 and 17-year-olds. And there are just a couple of points I want to make. One was the point I made earlier, that as a few people have said, there are kids that are benefiting from this stop. And I can definitely see in my 16 and 17-year-olds, the anxiety they experience every day at school and in their normal lives has been taken away from them. You know, they don't have the whole FOMO teenage who's doing what, who's going out with who thing, because no one's doing anything. Yeah. They've sort of been told that my 16-year-old whose GCSEs were cancelled, don't worry, it's what you did during the year, don't worry about it. Which then leads me to think, okay, what can we learn from this? You know, what can we take away from this? Because a couple of things strike me. One is the exam system is piling pressure on kids in a way that is unnecessary and could be improved. If you get to the end of 3 years of GCSE study and somebody says, don't worry, you don't need to take your exams, even a 16-year-old goes, well, surely there's got to be a better way of doing this if you think you can judge my performance without a set of exams. And I know that we're going to be looking at that in our education summit next week. You know, what is the future of education? And that's what I think, not dismissing any of the anxieties or issues that people are facing, which are very real. This is a moment to go, well, some things have worked, some things have reduced anxiety, some things have been shown to be just habit in education rather than necessarily the right format. So what can we change? What can we reset and learn from this? So that was, and back to the general anxiety in young people, which my kids are at school in London, and I promise you, it is off the flipping charts in some of these hot housing schools. They've learned that they're not defined by their schoolwork. They're not defined by what their predicted grades are. And it's been a really lovely few months for them just to be themselves and to explore other aspects of themselves, which isn't what their next mark is.
We've been running some think-ins I hosted a couple of think-ins with that kind of age range, like 16 to 19. And exactly as you say, there were quite a few people that would come along to those and say, actually, I didn't realize how much I needed a break until this break was forced on me. I didn't realize that I could actually read and enjoy it and just do it for my own pleasure. And I think they have echoed similar sentiments to you about the exam system, and how what I found really interesting is that they were very reflective about how kids in younger years, year 7, year 8, they remembered that they already felt that level of anxiety in those younger years, in the years before. So why not deal with it now before they get to 16? And
with girls, it's year 6. I mean, horrific in year 6 for them to make it's an incredible pressure at that young age. Anyway.
Thank you. Let's go to Professor Lucy if we can, and then Matt, and then we will round up.
Okay, it says that I can't unmute myself. Oh, am I on?
Right, we can hear you fine.
Okay. I just wanted to make a couple of points. I think obviously we know kids in school, in classes, are not equal to each other. I mean, my daughter's in a state school. I can't talk about the private sector. And we know that kids at home, aren't all in equal situations. One of the things that's happened early on in some of the COVID legislation is that local authorities don't have to support the children with special educational needs and EHCPs in the way that they did have to before. It's not because they want to be wicked, it's because they can't necessarily supply a speech and language therapist into a situation in school that may or may not be safe for that adult. And this has been written about in the special needs sector, hasn't been written about at all in the mainstream sector as far as I can tell. So in terms of, helping people catch up, it is true that children described as vulnerable, which could mean having an EHCP, or could mean having special needs, or could mean a few other things, have been allowed to go to school all the way through if their parents have let them. But they haven't been able to get the additional support that they would normally get. And I'm just wondering if it's worth trying to point this out, because tutoring will be absolutely fine. I think it's a good idea. In many respects, it will help some children with getting the attention that they need, but the catch-up may also need to happen in other ways that are to do with occupational therapy, to do with speech and language therapy, and to do with all of the other supports. And I just really wanted to say this other thing is that I have a friend who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist with CAMHS in East London. And it was a sort of a joke, but she said in terms of all of the families she's supporting, and she sees a lot of vulnerable people, it's a very mixed picture. I mean, many of the families and children have had more problems being at home under lockdown with each other, and they are having a worse time now. But she also said that the children whose problems stemmed primarily from being in school, that might be to do with special needs, might be to do with bullying, might be to do with stress, they're all cured. So it's, there's a whole range of different issues for these children. And it's, I think, important, as we've been saying, it's not all to do with the actual gap in education. I mean, I don't know, my daughter missed a term of school for pneumonia. The school wasn't really helpful. She did manage to catch up. It was hard to reintegrate with the friends. That was the hardest thing. It was the same for me. I was off for a term when I was 6. So I think schools, when the children are allowed to return in bigger numbers, are going to have to pay more attention to the socialization and the friendship groups.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and probably a great one for us to end on. because it has hit 2 o'clock and I have to very quickly try and sum up what has been a very wide-ranging conversation, but I think has just emphasised how many different areas of children's lives have been impacted by this, and that we need to talk about and discuss. And I do feel like, as many people in this conversation have said, particularly young people have been missing from this conversation, and that we quite often underestimate just how complicated the emotional lives of young children are, and how much they understand about the world around them and how much the world around them impacts them. And Ellen and Shirley both highlighted how important mental health is going to be in the future, the long-lasting impact of loneliness and the importance of play. Both of them really highlighted the fact that school is not just about education, it's about all the people that you meet, all the practicing for life and becoming an adult, and also working out who you are and how you interact with other people in the world around you. And kids have been missing out on that, and that's all children, and obviously that's something that we need to try and deal with. I'm going to try and do this very quickly because we're 1 minute past 2 already. Sarah emphasised the importance of one-to-one tutorials, and I think did highlight some of the real positive steps that are being taken to try and deal with this from a policy perspective, but also highlighted some of the areas that are missing. And as this conversation has shown, there are so many areas where we need to focus on, and this is not a situation where, as many people have said, one size will fit all. Every child is going to have had a different emotional experience, a different home experience, and have a different relationship to their school and their friends. And it's a massive task, but hopefully one that by talking about we can kind of proactively try and tackle. Thank you so much to all of our guests and all of our speakers who joined us today. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I'm sorry that it has run on slightly. I should also say thank you to Santander, who are our partner in Sensemaker, and you can read the Sensemaker Daily every day. It comes into your email box. And thank you so much for joining us. And do join us on the 25th of June for our Education Summit, where conversations like this will be happening all day, and it's a brilliant lineup. So come and join us. I'm going to say goodbye and wave to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye.